My name is Hank Stephenson. I work for I run the Yellow Sheet Report, which is a daily insider political tip sheet powered by the Arizona Capital Times, which probably some of you have heard of. We cover state politics. I've been doing it for a little bit more than a decade. And they asked me here to provide, I guess, like a non-democratic viewpoint. So what I'm going to talk about is just give you a quick lay of the land on what ALEC is from like a reporter's viewpoint. And then talk about some of the ALEC alternatives, and then model legislation and how you can kind of identify, or at least take the best stab in the dark that you can at identifying model legislation. So I think Domingo was just saying that when Democrats take the majority in Arizona, they'll be invited to ALEC. They are invited to ALEC. I've tried to send in Democrats with video cameras strapped to them for the last decade. They don't go. I know a handful who have gone. I know a couple who are there this year. They're generally more, I guess, conservative Democrats who are willing to go. I was actually just talking to a Republican lawmaker today who was telling me that one of the House Democrats was invited to go to ALEC and actually received an award from ALEC because he stood up to support one of Governor Doug Ducey's bills that eventually became model legislation. And the Democrat said, "Are you trying to get me unelected?" But he would not show up to this event and accept an ALEC award. But they are invited, basically, what ALEC does is it has conferences, 2 big ones a year, and they come up with model legislation. As the video correctly pointed out, one of the major differences between ALEC and other similar bill mill organizations is that corporate interests have a vote in what becomes model legislation. That's not the case at NCSL. I don't believe it's the case at SIX, the State Innovation Exchange.
Hank, could you please define NCSL?
Oh yeah, National Conference of State Legislators, and that's a little bit farther down on the list. But basically, it's a very similar organization. It's a conference for lawmakers, legislative staff to go to and toss around ideas. You know, what are you doing in your state? What works here? What doesn't work? It's more of a professional, like truly nonpartisan organization than like ALEC or SIX. A lot of times, like staffers will actually go to this, where with ALEC, it's mostly lawmakers going on junkets, essentially. NCSL is a little bit more professional organization, kind of like many of you, I'm sure, work in an industry where they have a big conference every year. In my industry, it's the investigative reporters and editors. Kind of the same concept, where people will get together and talk about what are you doing in Utah, what are you doing in Florida, what can we steal from there and do a good investigation in Arizona, or a good bill in Arizona, or you know, if you don't like ALEC's point of view, then a terrible bill in Arizona. So the other major difference, besides the fact that corporations or corporate interests get a vote in what becomes model legislation, is just the sheer scope of their junkets. The scholarships that the video mentioned, this week, tomorrow, ALEC is having its annual conference in Scottsdale, and they offer scholarships for lawmakers from all across the United States. We'll be getting drunk in Scottsdale's nice bars this weekend. It's going to be awesome. And up until I think Phil Lopes talked about ALEC Exposed. That actually grew out of a project that the Nation did back in 2011, 2012. They were among the early reporting that I ever saw on the topic. And they really put the spotlight on ALEC. Before that, very few people, even in the general political sphere, had heard much about ALEC. In 2011, 2012, 2013, it was all anyone was talking about. Since then, ALEC has changed. They've, to some degree, cleaned up their act as far as transparency goes, at least. You can go look right now on their website. They have their model legislation posted. It's debatable if that's all their model legislation, but they have a whole lot of model legislation posted. They have their 990s online. You can see who's funding them. And this year, for the first time ever, I had one of my reporters call ALEC and say, ask if we could get in. I expected the standard no. Years ago, we had asked. They kind of laughed and said no. This year, they invited us in. They told us, we will tell you every lawmaker who's going to be there how much they received in a scholarship. And then an hour later, they called us back and said, oh, we're not going to do that, but you can still come to the conference. So, progress, I guess. So there are like several, I mentioned State Innovation Exchange, 6. As Phil Lopes said, you know, I think he phrased it as they help draft progressive bills. They provide model legislation. It's progressive model legislation, but it's model legislation. It's the same thing. It's just less influential, especially in Arizona, and it hasn't been around as long. ALEC has been running since, I think, the 80s or something, and 6 came out of something called ALICE, which was a nod to ALEC. And I think it formed in like 2012, 2014. So it hasn't been around as long, isn't as influential, doesn't host as big of conferences. I just found out from Googling it that they had a conference here like last week. Did you go? I did. Ah, see? There we go. He was there. I wasn't. Nobody told me. And I kind of talked about what NCSL is. Well, do you agree with that? Like, do you think NCSL is basically a professional version of ALEC, taking a lot of like the partisan ideas out of it? Come on. Oh.
Okay, so NCSL, National Conference of State Legislators. I've actually looked at that because on the model legislation idea, there are certain times when you need to get a bill through or passed, and you have no idea how to write it or how it's going to be formed. So you look for model legislation for an idea of what needs to go in it, because there's always subparts and stuff to include. So I have actually crawled the NCSL site looking for other legislation that I can take a hint off of or a cue off of, and it is very professional. It is nonpartisan, except this past over the summer there was an NCSL conference, and a couple of our Arizona Supreme Court justices, or at least one of them and his wife and Doug Ducey, were there schmoozing with some other muckety-mucks.
They got their receipts and had a lot of fun with that yellow sheet.
Yeah, so that's concerning. But yeah, NCSL is pretty good now. The 6, I don't know if it was a conference that you were at, but the Democrats had a retreat, which is, the Republicans do it too, and a representative from 6 came in and was talking, and I don't think it was all that, it wasn't very heavy, it was a small portion, just kind of a meet and greet. There was no handing out of any kind of materials. I think it was just like, this is who we are, and call us if you might need us. But yeah, to the extent that model legislation is out there, it is informative. It's just like I said, from where it comes is the bad thing.
And that's like a perfect transition. What I was going to talk about next is just model legislation. Like first, I guess we should define the term model legislation. Like in your mind, is it model legislation if a lawmaker reads a newspaper article, sees that Utah is doing something interesting, goes and Googles the bill in Utah and copies, pastes it essentially into Arizona code? Maybe. It's much more clear when there's big organizations like ALEC drafting and promoting things as model legislation, but there's also like an organic nature to model legislation. Like if you look at the statutes in Florida, Maine, Michigan, wherever, they're going to look pretty similar to Arizona's. You know, murder is illegal. We're all dealing with how to regulate Uber right now. Bath salts a few years ago, like new drugs come on the market, whatever. So I don't think that necessarily model legislation is a bad thing. I think that the people deserve to know who's pushing this model legislation and where it's coming from. And ALEC has been hugely effective at doing that, and at doing that in the dark. Up until a couple of years ago, they never posted that stuff online. That video had the dramatic music set behind, like, can you believe that they go to junkets and are wined and dined? Like, how do you guys think the legislative process works? It's not ALEC, it's somebody. ALEC is essentially a middleman here. And I think, you know, Republican lawmakers are naturally inclined to want to hear from a organization that they agree with, like Democratic lawmakers are naturally inclined to want to hear from 6. And maybe they have some good ideas, you know, according to your views on the political spectrum. I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with ripping off those ideas. But there should be some mechanism to ensure that you can find out who exactly is behind it. And that's not the case. That's not the case with ALEC model legislation. That's not the case with any bill you see. You know, you can piece it together, as Domingo said, following the money, saying who will benefit from this, and taking some stabs in the dark. You can, honestly, the most effective way is if something catches your eye and you're curious if it's model legislation, go Google other Republican states, plus a couple of keywords from the bill. See if Utah's doing it, if Florida's doing it, then it's probably model legislation. Now that won't tell you if it's ALEC model legislation, or if it's Intel's model legislation, or Uber's model legislation, or whatever, but at least you'll know that, generally speaking, unless there's some kind of public health crisis, there's a reason that multiple states are focusing on this issue all at once. Especially when it's something, you know, not like Uber or bath salts or something new. And then, if I find something that, you know, leads me to believe that it's model legislation, ask the lawmakers. And don't ask them, is this model legislation from ALEC, because they're all just going to tell you no. I have a constituent who this is very important to. A better way to phrase it is, did you pick up this idea at one of the conferences this summer? They'll say, oh yeah, I had a great time in Texas, or whatever. So I think that, but doing it in any systematic way is darn near impossible. And you guys pointed to that awesome project that USA Today and the Republic just put together. Even that, as you said, it's like, it's impossible to use. It's, as I understand, they have a back end that's open to their reporters that they can do a little bit more with. But basically, what it does, and this idea was just ripped off from some colleagues of mine at the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting that they did back in 2015. They built essentially the same thing as what USA Today did last week. It was a little bit simpler and cruder, but essentially they're taking the text, the PDF of every piece of legislation, all 1,300 bills introduced in the legislature every year, and comparing that to the text of 1,300 bills introduced in Florida, and I don't know how many do in each other state, but all the bills in every other state, which it is like one, just like incredibly time consuming even for computers. The Republic was bragging that they had like 5 supercomputers working around the clock for several months or something in one of their descriptions. And even then, all you're seeing is that these texts look the same. That doesn't mean they came from the same source. It could be that, you know, everyone's trying to make Uber legal now, or outlaw bath salts, like that comes across as model legislation in this analysis. It doesn't mean that anyone's pushing it as a model legislation, just that they're similar enough that they're being caught as model legislation. So, it's like, it's basically impossible to do in a systematic way. But I think the best thing you can do is just like use your like common sense. Does it seem like a bill that, like, does something about this tick off that part of your brain, like Domingo was saying, that like something's just off, this feels weird. And then start with the Google machine. The Google machine is incredible. It knows about all the legislation in other states, all the legislation that's getting press. And like maybe that's the biggest shortcoming of this, is that the legislation that gets press is not necessarily the most important legislation. The legislation that gets press is the sexy legislation. It's not changing the tax code down 0.1% for a certain corporation that's going to mean billions of dollars in their pockets. So, you know, I think both ways of tracking this stuff has its shortcomings. But if y'all ever see something that you think is model legislation and want to holler, I'd be happy to poke around on it. I'm sure any other reporter who covers the Capitol in Arizona or elsewhere would be happy to do their best to either just point blank go harass somebody and ask them 3 or 4 times, where did you come up with this idea? Or at least, you know, do a little bit of the Googling around to see if it's in other states. I think that's all I got.